The stage is yours.
Thank you. Hey everyone, my name is Ben and I'm super excited to be here with this fantastic panel. The topic we're going to touch upon today is best practices for boards of VC-backed companies, and that's actually a topic which I've been thinking about a lot. I think it's probably one of the more neglected topics in the entire ecosystem. Boards play a super important role, and yet we don't spend much time discussing that. So hopefully this is going to be the starting point of a educated discussion about boards for venture capital-backed companies. Now, let me briefly start off by introducing you guys, and then I'll say a few words setting the scene, and then I'll hand it over to you. Anna. Anna is co-founder at Planetly, a company which is, I think, very interesting. They help companies to reduce their carbon footprint and analyze their carbon footprint. We've been talking a little bit backstage about, that you probably are rarely seen discussing other topics than sustainability these days. So I'm very glad that you've agreed to talk about management topics. After all, you still have to manage a company. Before co-founding Planetly, Anna was co-founder with Outfittery, so you actually do have a lot of first-hand experience also in previous roles. You used to work for Rocket Internet with boards, sitting on boards, probably on both sides of the tables if you so wish, so very happy to have your insights. Christian, by trade, is a lawyer, like me, but then he was smarter than I am, and he decided that he would rather do something else, and decided to work for BCG, and now is a strategic advisor with AVS. AVS is a company that does a lot of work in the HR and people business. You guys do executive search, but you also do a lot of strategic work. You do board design, corporate governance, advice to both growth companies and family-owned businesses. Now, finally, Florian, this man needs no introduction. I think everybody pretty much knows you. You're talking a lot about marketing topics, not today. Something else, it's boards again. I don't think you really need an introduction, but I've been going through your LinkedIn profile and basically wanted to count the boards that you were sitting on or the number of board observer seats that you hold, but I figured it was too much and it took me too long. The cap ride was over at the time when I scrolled down, so a lot of experience. So thanks everybody for being here today. Just a very few words from my side about the setup that we're going to be looking at today. We'll be talking about venture capital-backed companies and their boards. In Germany, we have a two-tier board structure, and I'm not going to bore you with the details, but I think for our international audience, it is important to note that what we're discussing is a two-tier board structure. So whilst the founders might be represented on the board, and we'll get to that in a second, it is purely a non-executive board, and we have a separate board where the founders are acting as the managing directors or as the executive directors, if you so wish. That is one thing that is important to note. Just a few more words on what the role of the board is. So mostly the board is a place for the company and its investors to discuss strategy, but also it is a means of investor representation, as oftentimes certain reserved matters, important decisions that require investor approval would be vested in the board. So it's not that you have a full equity vote, i.e. a shareholder resolution and everything, but a lot of decisions would be made on board level. So that's setting the scene, and that's going to be the setup that we'll be discussing, because of course we would probably having a bit of a different discussion if we were talking boards in public companies. Maybe the discussion would also be slightly different if we were discussing a one-tier board structure like you have in some other countries. Now, let me start off with a question for you, Florian. Very simple question. How large should a board of a VC-backed company be?
Yeah, I mean, what you typically see is something between 4 to 6 people, 4, 5, 6 people, and that's probably a good size, I would say, to represent some of the investor interest or some of the founder interest, but also probably give room for 1 or 2 people that have actually subject matter expertise that's relevant to the company. I mean, I've also seen larger boards where you got like up to 8, 10 people, but then the discussion becomes a little more difficult, I would argue. So not scientifically proven, but my feeling is that 4 to 6 is actually a good size. But I think what's really important that if you have this kind of board size, that you actually use it to have like some diversity on the board, not necessarily gender-wise. I mean, that's also nice if you have it gender-wise, but also you oftentimes have just, I don't know, one founder representative and 4 or 5 VC type people sitting on the board, and that's not what I definitely mean by diversity. Yeah, I mean that's you often have very similar backgrounds, and so that doesn't create the kind of diverse atmosphere. But I think if you want to have a good discussion, 4 to 6 is probably a good size. Yeah,
and odd or even numbers.
Ideally, odd numbers. Yeah, it kind of depends. I mean, for me, it's not so important a board as a decision kind of board, I have to say. I mean, at least in a startup context, it's more about having an educated and challenging discussion to move the business forward. And so it's not so much about taking an actual decision. I think the decision should always be taken by the management mostly anyway. Yeah. So, but I think so. I think if it's not a decision-making board, and especially in an early stage, I think it's not so important. I guess the moment you move to like a more structured company, more structured decision making, then probably it makes sense to have an odd number. Or what you also often see is that the somehow chair of the board has like a superseding vote if the votes would be even. Yeah. So, but I wouldn't care that much about this, to be honest.
Thanks. So let's further think a little bit about board design, and maybe next question for you, Anna. Do you think the founders should be necessarily represented on board level?
Yes, a clear yes to that, because I think the whole environment is changing a bit, that there's more and more venture money out there, and so the whole, like what has been a power play before, which was played more to the side of the investors, so startups applying for money, right? I mean, this was the world like 10 years ago. So a startup wanted to raise money, and then they needed to ask them back at the investors. This is now changed, right? So there's a lot of venture capital out there in the market. And there are as well, luckily, more founders, but still it evens out a little bit. So, and in that regards, I think you need to see, I mean, it is a company of the founders, that they originally started, that they put a lot of lifetime in, that they put a lot of risk in, and so on and so forth. And that's why, absolutely, they should be sitting on the board, and they should stay there for a very, very long time.
Sometimes the argument is made that the role of the board is also to supervise management, and in that context, I've sometimes been told that management shouldn't supervise itself. What do you make of that?
Yeah, but that's very theoretically, so I don't see this in reality. In reality, it's yes, it is about like really sparing, as Florian said, and it is about having good discussion, and as well about challenging the management, but it doesn't matter if they are like sitting on the board just in the room and discussing, or if they are like really sitting like on paper in this board. And I think it's rather a sign of actually like respect to the founders to give them this board seat, and or maybe to put it the other way, so I wouldn't accept any other setup myself. So I think if, as an investor, you would demand the founders not to be on the board, you should think about this twice if you wouldn't lose the good founders with that.
So, Christian, what's your view on the question of whether or not founders should be represented on board level? And maybe you could also comment on growth companies. Does that assessment change if we're not talking about the founders anymore, but if we're talking about external management? So a situation where the founders no longer have an operational role, but have moved on to maybe more of a strategic role, or maybe even have left the company entirely, and we have external management working for a VC-backed company. So maybe first part of the question, what's your view on founders being represented? And then second part of the question, does that assessment change if we're talking about external managers?
Well, thank you very much. I think you already said something very important when you mentioned the stage at which the company is. I think it really makes a difference whether you are in a startup stage or in a scale-up or growth stage. You have, it's natural for entrepreneurs and in a startup setting that you are an owner-operator. And as a company grows, I think it makes a lot of sense to separate the roles of owner and operator. That may mean that the same person still has both roles, but needs to know what hat am I wearing? Am I wearing my owner's hat at the moment, or am I wearing my manager's hat? But if you are just a manager, I think you should not be a board member. I think that should be clearly separated. I think the influence you have as an operator, as a manager, is pretty high already. And you have quite a lot of sort of almost monopoly on information. I think there has to be a separation between those who supervise and guide and support management. I think it's also a matter of understanding what is really the task. I think a board should look to the future and not to the past. And I think a board should serve also the management. You always say, oh, the board serves the owners, there's representatives of the VCs, and sort of the board is there to serve and represent the interests of the owners. I personally believe that while that is true, I think a good board also serves the management, tries to help them be the best management they can be. But it's important to separate those roles.
I would imagine that that's perhaps controversial. Question to you guys: Do you agree with that assessment that at a growth stage it would make sense to separate ownership on the one hand and management on the other side?
Yeah, I mean, if you what's probably a good reference point if you look at how PE boards are structured, so of PE-backed companies. We also do a couple of investments in that space, and that's where you typically see that. To be honest, so there you have the management, and typically the management is not part of the board. But as Anna, or as you've pointed out before, in most cases, or very often in PE-backed companies, it's like a hired management that's invested in the company, but that hasn't founded it. And so I think the more a company grows, the more probably also you need this kind of controlling element of the board, which probably isn't necessary in an early stage board. So I think also that question, I think as you've pointed out already, kind of depends on the stage of the company. I think in an early stage company, it's just about all getting the stuff off the ground, which is hard enough anyway. And I think the moment you have more to lose because you've built more substance, then it can probably, and also interests might diverge, also in terms of timing. I mean, that's what you very often see in a PE type board. Why? Because PE funds invest, and they have a timeline of 4 to 7 years. And within those 4 to 7 years, that's because of or 4 to 8 years sometimes, because their fund timeline runs out or whatever. So they have a legitimate interest to the company being exit ready in 5 years or whatever, and that might not be the same interest that the management actually has. Yeah, so I think the more you have kind of diverging or potentially diverging interests, which you don't have, I think, in an early stage, because in an early stage it's just about creating substance that is worth debating on. Yeah. And that's often not the case in early stage startups. But I think the moment you have more substance, then I think it probably makes sense to start by separating it. Yeah, that's probably one other thought that basically leads to the same conclusion.
We've been sort of moved or progressed a little bit from early stage to growth companies. To this end, one question maybe, well, either to you, Christian, or to you, Florian. What about independent board members? When would be the best time to bring in a truly independent board member, which I think is also quite common in PE-backed companies?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think perhaps better sooner than later. I think that truly independent board members can add a lot of value, especially when you look at sort of this role of supporting the management and helping them being the best management they can be. So if there is a disinterested, independent board member who is capable in the art of dissent. I mean, that's a big topic today, and I think dissent is very important. I mean, respectful and constructive dissent is very important on boards. And it's also, as I said, you need to look to the future. The country is emerging, is developing, is changing. It will normally need to have more structure as it grows. So it's good to have people who have seen that before, who know what good looks like, and can help the company guide on that path.
Maybe I jump in here because I have a little different view. So I worked with an independent board member, and what in my experience is that while it is great to have an additional resource, it can as well add a certain layer of politics to a board. Where before you with your investors are sitting in the same room, like you need to tell me the thing that you think about me and where I need to like put more attention on and so on and so forth. So there is a direct communication. And in the moment you have this independent board member, it oftentimes like is going via a third party somewhere in between. So I think this is something to consider as well. So there's not only upsides, I see.
But I think it also probably depends on the level of independence of that board member. Yeah. Because what you often see in PE-backed boards, while it is an independent person, in sense not working for the PE company, in fact it's dependent on the PE company. Yeah, because there's like they're more or less career board members, and I think then you exactly have the situation that you just described. So I think what really helps is if the person is truly independent, yeah? I think then and has the right kind of competence to complement what you already have there, and that is not that's like more difficult to achieve because I mean once you are kind of a career board member on boards, then you're always dependent because there's people appointing these people to boards. Yeah. So and I think then that's often that's why while we always try to basically say like to your point, bringing in independent board members or others than the VCs, let's call it that, or the investors. I think that's generally a good thing because it adds professionalism if it's done right. The people need to be incentivized right. They need to also co-invest ideally. Then I think, and they need to have the time to really dedicate, some resources to that. And then I think it can be a good thing.
It's a very interesting discussion. Now, probably not much of a surprise that I'm directing that question to you, Anna. Diversity. Florian has already mentioned it. There's empirical evidence, vast empirical evidence that diverse teams work better. Yet, if you look at your average venture capital-backed company board in Berlin, and Berlin really just being a synonym for any other place in Germany, you predominantly see white middle-aged men, perhaps some younger men, the founders. What's wrong with the ecosystem? Why are boards not diverse enough, even though there's empirical evidence that they should be?
Yeah, so maybe first and foremost, I don't think it is natural that you're pointing this question to me. I think you too should say something about this as well.
Fully agreed.
So secondly, in reality, diversity is hard, right? So there are all these studies, diverse teams perform better, but in reality, diversity means you need to argue and you need to have good arguments. And it is not that everyone on the table is anyhow thinking the same, so we don't need to do a big discussion around that, but you really need to come with good arguments. And that's why, and I think it is fair to say as well, that diversity is hard, and this is a point as well that we see. But when we all like work together, and this is true like for men and women, and are really like getting our stuff together, then we can create something much better together and can create much more diverse boards. And beforehand, I talked with Frenzy Kühne, who is a very experienced board member in big boards as well. And what Frenzy is always keep talking about is the Thomas cycle. So that is Thomas hiring another Thomas. And this Thomas, at some point, hiring and appointing another Thomas. right? So, and Thomas is the most common name in the boards out there. And I think this is not due to Thomas only like set out to find these other Thomas, but due to there are lots of different stuff and our world is complex and every one of us had like tons of things on the table. And then when it comes to hiring this open position, the hiring needs to be fast and so on and so forth. And then you are actually like looking into much more homogeneous like mass of applicants. And then in the end it is another Thomas. So I think if we all really like try a little harder to really find and identify the women out there who could be a great match for a position and take a little bit more time with the hiring and not rush too much and say like speed is the only component, but really think about it and commit to diversity and take a little bit more time. I think this can really change a lot.
Can I add something to
Sure.
that? I think I totally agree with what you say, but I would like to add. I think it's important to consider people for a board who you don't know yet. I think often people want to know people, want to have known the person who they appoint to the board. But that's limiting the pool too much. So I think one has to systematically look and include people who one hasn't known so far. And also one should absolutely look for people who have not been a CEO before. Because if you only look for people who have already had a CEO position or a comparable position in some company, again, you limit the pool too much. I think diversity means diversity also, and perhaps even foremost, of perspective. And you can have, maybe in the future you will have boards with lots of Susies, and then it will still not be diverse, also in terms of perspective. You need people who have a different way of looking at things and who enrich the discussions.
Probably one thing to add to what you said, Anna, I think that's very important to point out that diverse teams are only more productive or better if you learn how to deal with it in a constructive manner. So you need to invest some time into like having a common basis for discussion. Yeah? I mean, that's why I also co-founded basically a company with 4 friends because it's easy, it's fast, yeah, you're very efficient. And if you look at Zalando or whatever, you know, it's like study groups forming companies, and it works well initially, yeah. And then and I think that's a similar point we had before. Like, and you also founded a company like Outfittery with a good friend of yours because you knew it's very efficient, yeah. And I think and then I think once you've created something, and then I think the stage analogy also is valid here. Then I think the marginal benefit of being more diverse increases. Yeah, the more you grow, and the more you also have time to think about these things, and you can invest time into kind of creating the common basis for discussion. And I think that's often neglected. That people also, you have to invest some time into actually being able to communicate efficiently in a diverse setting before actually this setting being more productive. Yeah, and the other thing, and the other thought, I think it's a very nice idea to basically say you have to invest or work with people that you don't know before. I think one element of this breaking the diversity problem is you have to invest or trust into people that you just judge by their potential and not by their experience. Yeah? And that's also happening in development of people, not like internally, that we always try to do a lot, where we basically try to put people in positions where we haven't seen that they can do that, but we trust in their potential. And I think a similar thing you have to do here, because there are not that many female CEOs that have been in DAX positions before, so you have to trust the ones that are 1 or 2 levels below that they can actually do that. Yeah, and I think that is something that's not easy to be done, because it's different from what we've learned. Because we've learned to put people into positions based on their past experience, and that is often doesn't work in that regard. Yeah, and I think that's like one important element, that you kind of change your thinking into what's the potential rather than what's the experience. Yeah, that's probably another thing to add here. Yeah.
Anna, are you the chairwoman of Planetly's board? Does Planetly have a board?
I think not.
Okay. Do you think it's important to have a chair?
So
Is it
what was the
important to
question?
have a-
If we have a chair,
If you are the chairwoman of Planetly's board?
we don't have a chair currently.
Okay.
So it's the 2 founders, us being on the board, and then 1 investor who led the seed round.
And do you think it is important to have a chair on the board?
It could add value. I think I would answer this with the favorite answer of lawyers. It depends. So, and I think it very much depends on the stage of the company, and from which point it makes sense. I mean, I'm a big fan of ownership. So I'm a big fan of really having clear tasks, like who's preparing the agenda, who's leading the meeting, and so on and so forth. I mean, this should all be set as well without having this formal share on board.
I think that's sort of a good time now to move on a little bit from board design to some more practical questions, which I think the audience is probably also very much interested in, and then talk a little bit about how do you best work together as a board. In your experience, Anna, how do you prepare for a board meeting? Do you typically send out an investor pack or just an agenda? In very practical terms, how do you make sure that a board meeting is efficiently structured and really adds value?
Yeah, so pre-read, the whole pack before is very important, I say, and I really expect everyone as well to have worked through it before. So I don't like to read out again what is on the slides then. And one very practical tip maybe that I can give that we like to do is to really clearly mark the different points as inform, discuss, and decide. So, because otherwise everyone who's coming to this board meeting wants to add some value, and then sometimes you end up discussing things where I just said in the end, guys, I just wanted to inform you through that, but here's something else I want your opinion on. So I think it is clarity and good preparation makes a whole lot of a difference.
Florian, from having attended so many board meetings and having been on or currently being on so many boards, what's for our audience and in this group, what's the most hands-on or most valuable advice do you have in terms of preparing for a board meeting?
Yeah, I think alongside what Anna said, I think what's you want people to discuss in the board, yeah. So that means they have to prepare, and you should only have 1 or 2 topics per board meeting. So you shouldn't rush through 7 different sections and then have 20 minutes each. That I would rather concentrate on 1 topic or 2 topics. I would also bring in the people that actually do the work. Yeah, so not just having the founders present, but actually have, if you're talking about marketing, there should be the marketing director or whoever else is responsible for that. I think that is something that's good, to have the people actually directly being able to present and discuss and hear the feedback. I think that's good. And what I actually like, and that is something that we introduced at 2-3 boards now, and I like it a lot, is that the pre-read is actually not a presentation, but is actually written out text. Yeah? So that the people that prepare something for the board, that they prepared actually, it's also something that Jeff Bezos said, so it cannot be wrong. If a lot of people can write a lot of things in bullet points, yeah. So, but if you actually have to, if you have to fill the space in between, it actually requires some thinking, yeah. So writing a proper text is something that we're not used to that much, yeah, especially in the VC world, because it's you are poor soul. Yeah,
I have a lot of sympathy for what you're saying.
Yeah, but writing out something, it really shows you the deficiencies in your thinking. I think much better than if you write it on in a few bullet points. So I know it's more work, yeah, but if you just have it 3-4 days, 3-4 board meetings a year, that might actually be something that's not that bad. I mean, it's very tactical, but I think it has bigger effects than I would expect.
I would agree, especially if you're trying to write it out and still be brief. I think that's probably the real challenge. Florian just mentioned 3 or 4 board meetings a year. Is that sort of in line with your recommendation or your experience on how often a board should meet? And should that be physical meetings or remote meetings? Also thinking about what Anna does professionally, trying to reduce carbon footprint. How important is it that we have board members flying around the world 5-6 months a year to attend various board meetings?
I think it's important to have a certain variation. I think physical meetings are valuable or can be valuable and are to a certain degree necessary. But then they should be real quality time. So I would recommend at least once a year have a longer extended strategy meeting where people are present and really take time to interact. There's also some bonding, some team building among the board members and between the board and management who can be part of that, not of 100% of that meeting. And so that you have a good space for real reflection. And that you alternate that with other meetings, which were maybe more routine, which you can very well do virtually, where you have a VC, and then you can, being able to do VCs, and I think a lot of people in the last 2 years have learned how useful they can be. They have also learned about their limitations. But if you have well-structured, well-organized VCs, you could even do a few more. You can do, instead of having 4 board meetings or 5 board meetings in total, you could have 1 or 2 real bigger ones with quality time, and then another additional, maybe 5 shorter ones where you sort of really work in a more routine fashion. That's, I think, important. If I can add something to practical things, I think obviously it's important to have an agenda and to stick to it. There needs to be an owner of the agenda who makes sure it is. If you depart from the agenda, it should be consciously and not because you're just losing control. And I think minutes are very important. And the person who takes minutes, I think, should be, in a way, actively co-managing the meeting, saying, okay, sorry, I have to take the notes now. So what do you want me to write down? What has been the decision? No, I don't understand it yet. I need it really more precisely. So that if you have really precise minutes, and I think minutes should be out at maximum 48 hours after the meeting. And if you're good at taking minutes, you're doing them basically during the meeting.
Christian, without data, you're just somebody else with an opinion. How do you measure a board success? Are there any data-driven approaches in measuring whether a board does well?
Well, first of all, the most important thing is to do it. I think it's important to evaluate the performance and the value that the board is creating on a regular basis. And there are data-based approaches and tools and methods and platforms that can be useful, but I think they are not sufficient, at least in the long run. My recommendation, at least if you have a larger company, a sort of more in a growth stage already, not in a startup, is to regularly even do external board evaluations. So like maybe every year, sort of you alternate. 1 year you have an auto-evaluation where you can use sort of questionnaires and checklists or digital tools. And every second year you can complement that with an external board evaluation which is people-based, where you really talk to people, where you interview them, where you have confidential, doubly confidential conversations with all board members and with management to understand whether the board is really creating value. And then to have a face-saving, confidential way of discussing ways of how the board can be a better board. And I think that you cannot replace by data.
I think that we have time for one last big topic, which can be a bit touchy. Anna, how honest can founders be on a board, or how honest should they be? After all, your investors are represented on the board, and chances are that if you're not able to raise external capital from new investors, you'll have to turn to your existing investors and hope that they pitch in some more. Now, if you tell them that the company is going in an utterly wrong way, and you're discussing that on board level, they might not be prone to invest. How do you deal with that situation?
So I think founders should be extremely honest with their investors. So the whole board should encourage a very, very honest style of communication. I mean, they have the numbers anyhow, so why shouldn't be honest? But to be honest, now, personally, I think this was as well for me a development, and something that I now with Planetly in my second company, I'm doing completely different, and really said from the very beginning, and everyone should know this, we will be brutally honest with you because you're in the same boat, and basically only if we are honest with you, you can really help us solving the things. And I think there's one big change that changed over the last, let's say 10 years, and this is more and more of the investors have been entrepreneurs before themselves. And 10 years ago, that wasn't that like that. I mean, with Project A, it has always been the case. But like, if you like look to other funds out there, oftentimes there have been like professional investment managers or consultants in their former life and then turning investors, right? So all that they know is these Excel spreadsheet view and like following the numbers there and so on and so forth. So this is then like limited value when they give you advice. But when they've done it before, when they've like walked through all the mud before themselves as entrepreneurs, then the advice is so much more valuable. And as like these people are now like who had successful exits now turn to investors and now on partner level on many funds, I think the whole quality of advice that can go from investors to startups is increasing. And in order to capture that value, you need to be honest.
Florian, would you give money to one of your portfolio companies, even if on the founders and the board in your meetings tell you that the company is not doing well?
I mean, if you look at most successful companies I've somehow been involved in, none of them only went like this. Yeah? So there always turns somehow. Also, Zalando had problems, or HelloFresh had problems. I mean, all companies have problems at one day in time, and I think that's a normal. That's just how life works. Yeah, not only professionally, but in general. And I think what you need to differentiate is whether it's a, somehow tactical problem on the way, or whether it's a systematic problem that basically proves your investment hypothesis wrong. Yeah, but then it's also something you should discuss with the founder, because also if in early stage investing, it's completely normal that things fail. Yeah, that also things turn out not to make sense in the end. And in the end, it's not just us losing money, but it's also people losing a lot of time. Yeah, so and I think that's a very honest discussion you have to have, whether the problems that we currently see is that something underlying that basically proves the whole model wrong, or whether it's just something where we had like a problem in, I don't know, performance marketing, where we didn't do this the right or that right, or set up the IT infrastructure in the wrong way, and that's why we cannot grow. And I think that I think shows you. And that's such a fundamental question, because otherwise, everybody's just wasting a lot of resources, whether it's the founder's time or our money. And I think that's why it's so important to have like these different levels of discussion, right? And have a clear, honest discussion about it. But it's very hard to establish that, yeah. And it's also very hard to find that up front, because there's just personality types that like to create situations of asymmetric information. Yeah. Also very successful founders, yeah, and also very successful investors. So that's one of the key things I try to find out when I deal with a person, whether that person also is willing to engage with me in a way that allows an honest kind of communication and exchange. And that's not always given, because I think it's basically personality based, and that's very hard to change. Yeah. Okay, sorry.
Pop up. I know there are a bunch of young founders in this room right now, and it's just such an amazing panel. So sorry for interjecting, but if there are questions to these five as well, but 4 amazing people, I think now's the time to shoot them. Otherwise, we have some from the chat as well. But please don't be shy. I know Florian loves questions, at least, Mono personally, so he's willing to provide any answers to your questions that you have. There is one from the chat then, from Peter Meyer, who goes, do you send your meeting agenda, so it's a very polite question actually, do you send your meeting agenda to each board member individually and set up calls with individual board members in advance?
I don't like too much individual discussions up front, because I think it kind of fosters this political kind of discussion that Anna said up front. So I would avoid, because that's like a source of asymmetric information. Yeah, right. And that's what you want to avoid. So I wouldn't, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, if there's specific questions on the board material that just are my interest and not anybody else's, then you might have a discussion on that afterwards. But I would try to communicate to the board in a consistent team type manner, and I think doing that individually kind of counters that a little bit.
Can I add one quick thing to it? I think everything you just said also before is all about trust. And I think it's so important to create trust in a board. And it takes some time, and it takes goodwill, and there's also some methods about doing that. And then you can worry less about asymmetric information and all these things.
Lovely. Thanks so much. Due to time constraints, I have to cut it short here. It's been very valuable. You've got some great feedback in the chat. Thanks so much. Interesting insights. Again, give it up for these four amazing people.